You will often hear people talking about the professional photographer. The professional photographer is often seen as being above other photographers, better, more professional and not amateurish. But what exactly is a professional photographer? In many professions, the distinction between a professional and an amateur or even a beginner is fairly easy to explain. However, in photography, it's a bit different. I don't have anything against the term professional photographer itself, but I think it's often used incorrectly, leading to the perception that all other photographers are worse or less skilled, and that's where I have an issue. So, what is a professional photographer and what truly defines a photographer itself? That's what we'll explore in today's video. But for now, here's the intro first and then we'll get started. To get to the bottom of this, as often the case, we first need to take a look back in time. And here's a quick disclaimer. In this video I'll briefly touch on some legal matters, but only superficially. Since I'm from Germany, these will relate to the German law, but I believe the core message of this video applies to any country and anyone in the world who's interested in photography. Today anyone can simply call themselves a professional photographer. But until 2004 things were a little bit different. Back then you needed formal training to be able to call yourself a photographer. After 2004, photography became a so-called non-regulated profession in Germany. As I mentioned, we are talking about the German law here, and the reasons I'm bringing this up is quite simple. I believe this was a very good development. I will explain why I believe that in a second, but for now let's skip forward 20 years. 20 years later, we are technologically on a completely different level. Almost everyone has a smartphone in their pocket capable of producing photos that professionals from a few decades ago could only dream of. But does that automatically make everyone a professional photographer? I don't think so, but how can we differentiate? The term professional often describes someone who earns a living by performing a certain activity. So one might say that anyone who makes money from photography is a professional photographer, and everyone else isn't. But in my opinion, this is pretty unfair to say. There are plenty of examples where people became well-known photographers without ever making much money from it. Take for example Vivian Maier. She was an American who, by this definition, would not have been considered a professional photographer, so not a real photographer at all basically. But if we look at her images and the recognition some of her photographies have gained, I think we can all agree that she was definitely a professional photographer. As far as I know, she never made money from her work, as I said, and many of her photos became known after her death in 2009. I sometimes get the impression that some photographers, especially those from the older generations, view these developments with a bit of skepticism. They might not be too thrilled that anyone can now officially call themselves a professional photographer. And I can certainly understand that, as these people often had to go through years of training to earn the title photographer. But I also believe that the profession of photography is one of those that has changed the most over the course of the last 30 years. So let's look back 30 years. 30 years ago, almost every photographer was still shooting on film, and the technology of digital photography was still in its infancy. Then, in the mid-2000s, the shift to the digital age suddenly took place. On top of that, it became increasingly more important to position oneself well on the internet to stay competitive with all the other photographers out there. And now we find ourselves in the midst of yet another huge transformation. The age of artificial intelligence has dawned, and photography has already been and will be continued to be massively influenced by it, I'm sure of that. And precisely because so much is changing in photography, I believe it's the right development that people are no longer forced to complete formal training in this profession, where content might be taught that might not be important in a few years' time anymore. It's easy for me to say, of course, since I haven't undergone formal training as a photographer, yet I still earn my living from it. But even now I find it difficult to call myself a photographer. Somehow, in the back of my mind, I still feel like I don't fully deserve this title. Another way some people try to distinguish between professional photographers and everyone else is through the photos themselves. This seems to be the most obvious approach, since if we see the photographer as a craftsman, the photo is the product they create. However, I also feel that some older photographers again sometimes think they can determine who is a professional based on the old classic photography rules. But here we run into another problem. Many great photos are so great precisely because they intentionally break the rules. To consciously break a rule, you need to know the rule first, so this argument does hold some weight to it. And I want to make it clear that I have no intention of criticizing photographers who've been in the industry for a long time. Actually, the opposite is true. I believe that you can learn a lot from these veterans of photography. I follow many of them on social media and I regularly watch their videos and read their blog posts. I always enjoy learning from them and their experience. What I'm trying to say here is that it's crucial, not just in photography, but in many professions and I believe in life in general, to keep up with the times and to keep up with new technology and not resist change. Earlier I referred to photographers as craftsmen, but even that can be questioned. Is photography really a craft or is it more in form of art? If you consider photography as an art form, which I personally believe in, then all arguments about rules become obsolete at an instant, because as we all know, there are no rules in art. But let's return to the original point of this video. At the beginning I mentioned that I'm not a fan of how the term professional photographer is sometimes used. I'm not sure if it's just me or if others have noticed it too, but I sometimes feel that the term professional photographer can be used in a way that indirectly devalues photographers who don't meet the self-imposed standards of certain individuals. But as we have seen, much of photography is subjective. Just like in art, beauty in photography is in the eye of the beholder. The work of a photographer, a photography, might be seen as unappealing and unprofessional by one person, while another might find it absolutely beautiful. And that's why I believe it's not right for any photographer to place themselves above another one and claim that just because they may have been in the industry longer, they are a real professional, while someone else is not a real photographer. But what then is the difference between someone who occasionally snaps a picture with their phone and someone who's been successfully earning a living from photography for decades, with camera equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars? The question might seem trivial at first, but I think it gets to the heart of this video. And now here's my personal individual perspective on this. While this entire video is essentially my own opinion, what I'm about to say now is something everyone can define for themselves, and I think that is a really good thing. Me personally, I believe that what matters most is what you think about yourself. The guy with the phone on the beach, who maybe take a few nice photos of the sunset, probably wouldn't consider himself a photographer if you ask him. On the other hand, the person who has been making a living of photography for many years will most likely say, yep, I'm a photographer, if you ask him about his profession. Additionally, I think a photographer should have some understanding of the craft. They should know how a camera works, understand what aperture, shutter speed and ISO does to a photo. A personal interest in photography is, in my opinion, very important as well. And I believe most people who consider themselves photographers have spent a lot of time learning about photography, whether they learned it off books and off the internet, by themselves or in a formal training. Moreover, a photographer has probably already engaged with their own photographies, analyzing them, reflecting on why one photo might look beautiful while another one doesn't work as well. And I also believe he learned about photo editing to bring out the best in every single image. The hobby shooter on the beach in our example will probably just hold up their phone, take 5 pictures of the sunset, maybe send 2 of them to the family WhatsApp group without giving it much more thought. This brings us to the final point, which is the intention behind the photo. As a photographer, no matter what you're shooting, if you're a landscape photographer, a portrait photographer, a wedding photographer, but no matter what, you want to create the most aesthetically pleasing and beautiful image possible. You might think about how to frame a subject, play with different elements in the frame, and use depth to enhance the image. As I've mentioned before, this is just my opinion and everyone is free to define it as they wish. I hope this video helped to convey my thoughts on this topic, and I'd be happy to hear from anyone who watched this video and wants to share their opinion. As I often reflect on photography related topics, it would be interesting to see how others view these issues. So with that said, we have reached the end of today's video. If you watched this far, thank you so much for your time. Feel free to check out my YouTube channel where I have many other videos on photography. But for now, I wish you a great day and goodbye.